Hi, everyone. All right, I am also going to share my screen if I can find the right one. And you should be looking at a slide that just says 3 emerging principles. And I'll just quickly, I had, let's see, 8, I'm going to focus on a course on inquiry that I taught last semester. They were primarily first semester master's students. I had 18. From week to week, about 11 to 14 were remote, and the others were in person. And this is about the flip of what I'm expecting this spring with my undergraduates. So I'm still playing with these ideas, but these 3 kind of ideas emerge for me as being really important, and you'll see how they played out in the tools that I chose. So one was this idea of connected people, keeping things really small. The second was the idea of connecting resources and providing redundant access to students for the things that they needed for class each time. And then this connected everything, like doggedly mapping where we were in the course, how pieces fit together and how they built on one another. And taken together, I think those things were really, really helpful in our all sort of learning in this very weird hybrid environment. So let me talk first about keeping things small. I did it in 2 ways. One was structurally and how I organized time. And then the other was in thinking about sort of the work inside the work that we did together. So very quickly, the keeping things small, I approached, initially we tried to do, our class meets for 3 hours. Initially, I sort of thought of everybody going through the same thing. And one of the things that became really clear to, I think, many of us in the spring was that relationships were absolutely everything. And to know my students as learners, I needed to be able to think with them and hear with them in sustained ways. And that was really difficult when I was trying to look at people in the classroom, look at people online, all at the same time. And even in a small class like 18 students, people can hide. And it was also really important for students themselves to be connected and have relationships with one another. And so I needed to make sure they could hear each other. So what you're looking at on this screen is an agenda, sort of 2 sample agendas. In one of them, I divided the students, how they proceeded through the 3 hours depended on whether they were on campus or not. In the one on the right, you'll see it depended on, they were doing some kind of very mini presentations. And you'll notice that essentially I met each, if you were in the presentation round 1 group, you started out with presentations. And then you went into the whole group convening where we had kind of a discussion, interactive lecturette thing on race, ethnicity, power, and epistemology and research. And then they went off and they began to work on tasks that they needed to get done for the next session. This was very much of a project-oriented session. There were others where I did a similar kind of flip, sort of half of the class does one thing, we come together for a period of time, and then they flip and they go off and do something on their own. But the point is that I was able to be then with half the class and to be able to pay attention to their thinking in much closer ways. And they were also able to see one another. And I can talk a little bit more about this later if people would like to see, but this was really helpful for me to begin to break out the sessions. Students also really liked it. After we did it for the first time, I got so many emails from students saying, thank you. It was really, really helpful for us to be able to work in and navigate and think with you in smaller groups. The second way that I kept things small was drawing, and I'm not going to go into much depth on this, was tapping into the Liberating Structures tool. I really recommend that you go and you check them out if you haven't. Essentially, liberating structures are these protocols and ways of organizing small group work. They map everything out. They provide some images, some tools, and literally they provide the directions. But what they help, they structure conversations that might be analytical, that might be deliberative, that might be creative. And I found that these structures really help students to slow down, think carefully and closely about the work that we were doing and the readings that we were doing, and then to you know, essentially, and connect with one another and really hear one another. So those small groups began to develop relationships with one another in ways that I hadn't heard before. Like Julie and Jesse, I had students record on common documents. And Lisa, I didn't have so much trouble with the students sort of copying each other. Part of it was that I actually was then, when they were working in breakout groups, I did drop in and out. Sometimes I kept my video off, but they could see that I had come in. And I think that they felt like an accountability. And for whatever reason, they also felt like they wanted to be creative. We'll see whether the undergraduates are similar in the spring, but it was not an issue that I had much. There was also an accountability that they knew that when they had small group work, and we weren't going to have a full class debriefing afterward, they knew that I was going to pick up pieces from their small group work and carry it forward into the next session. So you'll see written in blue, you know, here I've just said we'll draw from takeaways to frame discussion of key themes and questions for next week. So that was the second, those were the, you know, how did I keep, what helped me support active learning? I would say it was keeping things small in those two ways. The second, how did I help kids keep track, was this idea of connected resources and redundant access, and I can actually bring it up here. But essentially every week I had a session agenda in which I had links to everything that they were going to need for that week. And so you'll see that the agenda had a link to the session slides. It had a link when they were doing presentations, there was a listener feedback form, which each person had essentially their own section, and people went in and they filled in responses to them. They had, and then if they were doing small groups getting ready for their research, they had, you know, again, they had the resources that they needed. If there was any small group work, I listed how the small groups would be made up. If I was planning, there were some different directions for the small groups, but essentially this anchoring Google Doc was incredibly helpful for them. And what I found was that some of the disengagement, I'd never realized this before, was because students just didn't even know where they were supposed to be sometimes, or what resource they were supposed to be using. So they knew they needed the Google Doc. The link to the agenda showed up. I posted it in the announcements. I posted it in Brightspace in my section where they would link to the Zoom. I would always have the link there, and then I also sent an email. So just amazing redundancy. This also then I attached it then belatedly to the syllabus. And the reason that I did that was because I also wanted them to keep coming back to the links that we were making between everything, and to begin to see how all these pieces fit together. So this third piece around connected everything, kind of doggedly mapping, so they could see how a theoretical reading linked to an applied reading, linked to what we were doing in class, and linked to an assignment, and then how the assignment pushed back up. And I will just flash one last thing, because I think I am way over my time. That essentially helping students constantly see where we were, and how they could draw from something we had done to inform something they were about to do, was another way that was really helpful. And lots, so I used lots and lots of visuals, and I will continue to do this. One of my students suggested that rather than having only my syllabus listing, where I've got sort of the typical week by week, read this is the topic, here's what you have assigned, they suggested that I actually start providing these kinds of maps for students so that they can see. So just very quickly so you can make sense of this. In the darker blue, there are theoretical, there are kind of our core topics. In the gray are more theoretical pieces. In the light blue are sort of case examples or enactments of that. of those theoretical ideas. And then each of these arrows connect into I show how they can draw from certain assignments to help them think about particular assignments. So the community, these bright green were the tasks that they had to do through the course. And again, they found those mapping structures incredibly helpful. So that's what I did.